You've entered void of rules, where chaos reigns and darkness consumes all. In this twisted realm where all laws have crumbled, only one rule remains, and those who break it are cast into eternal digital oblivion. The rule is simple: subscribe. We're almost at 4,000 corrupted souls, but the void hungers for more. Our goal is 10,000 subscribers before this year bleeds into darkness. Will you join our legion, or face the consequences of defying the void? Now let's jump into today's story. The scent of aged parchment had become my drug of choice, more addictive than caffeine, more comforting than sleep. For 3 years I'd worked in the Biblioteca Medicia Laurentiana in Florence, translating obscure religious texts that most scholars would dismiss as medieval fantasy. But Adrian Holt didn't dismiss anything. I dissected every word, every symbol, every margin note, searching for the truth my father claimed didn't exist. Richard Holt, philosophy professor and destroyer of families, had walked out on my devoutly Catholic mother and me when I was 12. His parting gift was a sentence that had shaped my entire adult life. Faith is just collective delusion, Adrian. There's nothing hidden in those books except the fantasies of desperate men. 24 years later, surrounded by manuscripts that whispered secrets in dead languages, I was still trying to prove the bastard wrong. The Biblioteca was my cathedral. Michelangelo's architectural masterpiece where scholars worship knowledge instead of gods. Every morning, I climbed those worn stone steps like a pilgrim approaching a shrine, carrying questions that had no business being answered by mortal minds. My colleagues called it obsession. I called it research. The distinction mattered less than the results. That September morning felt different from the moment I walked through the doors. The air carried an electric tension, like the moments before lightning strikes. Father Morillo waited in the main hall, his usually composed demeanour fractured by something I'd never seen before. Genuine fear. Adrian. His voice carried an urgency that made my pulse quicken. My office, now. 3 wooden crates dominated the corner of his study, their surfaces marked with Vatican seals so fresh the wax still held fingerprints. These weren't ordinary archival shipments. The Vatican guarded its deepest secrets jealously, releasing materials only when circumstances demanded extraordinary measures. Arrived from Rome at 3 this morning, Father Morillo explained, his hands betraying a tremor he couldn't quite control. Sealed for over a century in vaults that predate St. Peter's Basilica. Cardinal Torretti specifically requested you handle the cataloguing. Why me? Your reputation for thoroughness has reached certain circles. They need someone who won't dismiss anomalies, scribal errors, or natural decay. The first 2 crates contained treasures that would have made any medieval scholar weep, illuminated manuscripts with gold leaf that still caught light like captured stars, papal correspondence bearing the seals of popes, whose very names carried historical weight. Magnificent, certainly, priceless, undoubtedly, but nothing that justified the fear radiating from Father Morillo like heat from fever. The 3rd crate made my skin crawl before I even touched it. The wood felt wrong. Not cold, but hungry, as if it absorbed warmth and refused to give it back. When I lifted the lid, a smell escaped that belonged to no earthly archive. Copper pennies dissolved in burning incense with an underlying note of something organic and profoundly wrong. Beneath protective silk that whispered against my fingers lay a single tome. The binding wasn't leather, at least not from any animal I could identify. Grey and scarred, marked with burns and gouges that suggested repeated attempts at destruction, all of them failures. The cover bore no title, just deep indentations where letters might once have been before something with claws scraped them into illegibility. I lifted the book, surprised by its weight. The binding felt organic beneath my fingers, warm and textured like skin, with a subtle pulse that couldn't be my imagination because it didn't match my heartbeat. "Careful," Father Murillo whispered from behind me, his voice tight with the kind of terror that comes from experience. The first page stopped my breath. Names. Hundreds of them, written in scripts that span centuries and civilizations. Medieval Latin flowed into Renaissance Italian. Gothic German merged with languages I couldn't identify. Scripts that seemed to predate known writing systems. Some names were scratched out with violence that had torn through multiple pages. Others gleamed with ink so fresh it reflected the lamplight. Each entry followed the same format: surname, given name, date. The chronology began in the 13th century and continued through ages of human history I'd studied, but never seen documented with such intimacy. These weren't historical records. They were something else entirely. I flipped through pages that chronicled humanity's hidden casualties, recognizing names from academic obituaries, scholars whose mysterious disappearances had become footnotes in university histories. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Researchers, theologians, anyone who delved too deeply into certain kinds of knowledge. Near the back, the entries became contemporary. Modern handwriting recorded modern dates, lives that had ended within my own lifetime. The ink grew fresher with each page until I reached the final entry. My vision blurred. The room tilted. "Holt, Adrian." Written in fresh black ink that pulsed with its own heartbeat. Dated today. Not yesterday, not last week, but today. September 15th, in handwriting that matched my own signature with surgical precision. I touched the letters. The ink came away wet, burning my fingertip like acid while leaving a stain that seemed to spread beyond the boundaries of my skin. The book fell from my hands, hitting the floor, with a sound like breaking bones. "Father," I whispered, my voice barely functional. "My name is in this book." Father Murillo's face transformed from olive to ash, in the space between heartbeats, his eyes fixed on the fallen tome, with recognition so complete it could only mean one thing. He'd seen this before. "Where exactly did you find it?" Each word carried the weight of confession. My name, fresh ink. Today's date. Someone wrote my name this morning. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Father Murillo stared at the book as if it might attack, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles had gone white. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of terrible knowledge. The liber nominibus damnatis. The Latin rolled off his tongue like a curse in reverse. The book of damned names. I prayed I would never see it again. "What is it?" "A registry of the marked, a catalogue of souls selected for collection." He made no move to touch the book, maintaining distance as if it radiated spiritual poison. "You should not have seen this, Adrian. No living person should see this and remain unchanged." "Someone's playing an elaborate joke. The list maintains itself." His voice cut through my denial with ecclesiastical authority. "No human hand adds these names. They appear according to laws we cannot comprehend, written by something that learned our alphabet, for purposes we were never meant to understand." I stared at him, waiting for the rational explanation that would restore my world to sanity. Instead, he moved to his window, gazing at the Tuscan hills, as if seeing ghosts among the cypress trees. 30 years ago, I was assigned to the Vatican's deepest archives, chambers that existed before Rome was an empire, vaults carved into bedrock that remembers the first human footsteps. We had another book, like this one, kept behind locks that required papal permission to open. His voice took on the cadence of confession, each word weighted with memory. 3 brilliant minds were assigned to study it. Dr. Marcus Antonelli, who could read Latin like poetry and decoded manuscripts others declared impossible. Professor Heinrich Zimmer, a linguist who spoke 14 languages and understood 3 more that were supposedly extinct. Father Giuseppe Toretti, Cardinal Toretti's younger brother, one of the finest theological minds the Church had produced in centuries. What happened to them? They disappeared. Not transferred, not reassigned, not killed. Erased. One day they were cataloguing and translating, filing reports that documented their progress. The next day their offices were empty. Their belongings had vanished. Their personnel files showed no record of their existence. Father Murillo turned back to face me, his eyes holding depths of anguish that spoke of sleepless decades. But erasure went deeper than administrative records, Adrian. Their families forgot them. Wives who had shared beds for decades couldn't remember their husbands' faces. Children grew up with no memory of their fathers. Every photograph they had ever appeared in was blank. Faces erased as completely as if they had never existed. That's impossible. I searched for them personally, spent months following every lead, consulting every possible source, according to every record I could find. Church documents, civil registries, university archives. These three brilliant men had never been born. The world itself had forgotten them. He picked up a small crucifix from his desk, turning it over in his hands as if seeking comfort from its familiar weight. The only evidence they had ever lived existed in my own memory, and even that felt uncertain, as if something was actively trying to erase them from my mind, leaving only vague impressions that someone important was missing from my life. You're telling me this book is cursed? I'm telling you that some knowledge comes with prices that compound over time. The church doesn't hide these artifacts out of superstition, Adrian. We hide them because they're real and they're hungry, and they never stop feeding on human souls. I looked down at the book, still lying open on the floor with my name glowing like a beacon among the countless dead. My rational mind screamed that this was elaborate theatre, some kind of psychological test or initiation ritual. But Father Murillo's terror was too authentic to be performance. There must be some way to remove a name, I said, some ritual or procedure the church has developed. No. His voice carried absolute finality. I've researched every possibility, consulted every expert the Vatican maintains. There is no removing a name once it appears. The book chooses its prey according to criteria beyond human understanding, and it has never released anyone. Then what am I supposed to do? Just wait to disappear? Father Murillo was quiet for a long moment, his fingers working the crucifix like prayer beads. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. There are stories, whispered legends that may or may not be true. Some claim there are ways to transfer the marking, to offer another soul in exchange for your own. Human sacrifice, survival, and the terrible choices that survival sometimes demands. The room fell silent except for the distant sounds of normal life. Tourists laughing in piazzas, vendors calling their wares, church bells marking hours in their eternal rhythm. The world continued while I sat staring at my own death warrant written in impossible ink. If your name is there, Father Murillo said finally, then something has already marked you for collection. Speaking of it may have sealed your fate, but ignorance would have guaranteed it. Your only hope now is to learn everything possible about what's hunting you. Where do I start? With Dom Niccolo Benedetti. If anyone understands the true nature of the liber nominibus damnatis, it's him. That night lasted forever. I lay in my apartment staring at ceiling cracks that seemed to form letters in the lamplight. Every rational explanation I constructed crumbled under the weight of what I'd experienced. The book was real. The ink was wet. My name was written in a hand I didn't recognize but somehow felt familiar. As midnight approached, sounds began emanating from within my walls. Soft scratching at first, like mice or settling timber, but the sounds were too methodical, too deliberate. They moved from room to room with purpose I could follow, tracing patterns that gradually became recognizable. Letters. Someone or something was carving letters into the wood and plaster behind my wallpaper, spelling out words with inhuman patience. Adrian Holt. The scratching continued for hours, sometimes soft and hesitant, sometimes violent enough to shake picture frames. My name being etched into the bones of my home by invisible claws, claiming territory with the persistence of rising water. Dawn revealed the evidence. My name, repeated hundreds of times, carved with surgical precision into every surface. Walls, furniture, the bathroom mirror, all marked with fresh scratches that caught morning light like accusations. I photographed everything, measured the depth and spacing, documented the evidence with academic thoroughness, even as the human part of me recoiled from the implications. No natural force could have created these marks. No prankster could have gained access without leaving other traces. Something supernatural was stalking me, marking its claim on my life in the most literal way possible. I called in sick and spent the day researching Vatican conspiracies and cursed manuscripts. Most sources yielded nonsense. New Age speculation about supernatural forces, conspiracy theories about secret societies. But buried in academic footnotes, I found references to the Congregation for Extraordinary Affairs. The Vatican's Supernatural Investigation Department existed in a grey area between official acknowledgement and complete denial. Scholarly papers mentioned it cautiously, always with caveats about unconfirmed reports and institutional secrecy. According to these sources, the church maintained a small team dedicated to investigating supernatural claims. Everything from weeping statues to demonic possessions to artifacts of questionable origin. One paper cited a former priest named Dom Niccolo Benedetti, who had allegedly worked for the congregation before being defrocked in 1998. The dismissal was described vaguely, mentioning only irreconcilable differences regarding acceptable research methodologies. Finding him required 3 days of careful inquiries in Tuscan mountain villages. Locals spoke of the mad priest in hushed tones, crossing themselves when they mentioned his name. He lived in ruins near Montalcino, they said, paying for supplies with gold coins that made shopkeepers nervous and speaking to invisible companions in languages that predated Latin. I found him on a grey October afternoon in the remains of an abandoned monastery. Dom Niccolo Benedetti sat in what had once been a chapel, a thin figure in patched robes that seemed to shift colour when viewed peripherally. He appeared younger than expected, early 60s perhaps, but his hair was wild and completely white, and his eyes held the kind of intelligence that cut through pretense like a blade through silk. "You're the linguist from Florence," he said before I could introduce myself, the one whose name appeared in fresh ink. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I've been dreaming about you for weeks. A young man obsessed with proving his faithless father wrong, working in a library that touches the Vatican's deepest secrets. A man whose mother died praying for a reunion that would never come. The accuracy of details he couldn't possibly know left me speechless. My mother had indeed died 3 years ago, rosary still wrapped around her fingers, praying until the end for my father's return. The dreams have been very specific," Dom Niccolo continued, gesturing for me to sit on fallen stones that had once been an altar. "They showed me the book, the names, the fresh ink that burns when touched. They showed me your terror and your desperate need to understand what's happening. Father Murillo said you worked for the Congregation for Extraordinary Affairs." His laugh was bitter as winter wind through empty corridors. "I worked for them until I learned too much, asked too many questions, refused to accept that some knowledge should remain buried forever. The Church prefers its supernatural investigators to be believers first and scientists second. I made the fatal mistake of prioritizing truth over institutional comfort." "What can you tell me about the Liber Nominibus Damnatis?" Dom Niccolo stood and began pacing among the ruins, his movements betraying agitation that spoke of memories better left undisturbed. 26 years ago, I was summoned to investigate reports of a cursed manuscript. discovered beneath the Sistine Chapel. Workers renovating the foundations had broken through into a chamber that didn't appear on any architectural plans, a room that had been sealed for over 4 centuries. He paused beside a crumbling wall, running his fingers along stones placed by hands that had been dust for 500 years. The workers who opened that chamber all died within a month. Heart attacks, strokes, accidents that made no sense. The church called me in to determine whether the deaths were coincidental or supernatural in nature. And you found the book. I found something that defied every category I understood. The binding wasn't leather from any animal, catalogued by science. The pages weren't parchment made from any recognizable hide. The ink responded to observation, growing darker when watched, fading when ignored. Lightning flashed overhead despite clear skies, and I caught that familiar scent of copper pennies and burning incense on the wind. "It knows you're here," Dom Niccolo whispered, his voice tight with old fears. "It knows you're learning the truth. The entity that creates the names is always listening, always watching for signs that its prey is beginning to understand." Entity? What kind of entity? Something that existed before humans developed language, before we learned that symbols could capture thoughts and preserve them beyond individual death. It watched us evolve from grunting primates to articulate beings, observed our development of writing systems, our creation of permanent records. His voice took on a professorial quality, as if he were still the scholar he'd once been before knowledge corrupted him. Imagine an intelligence that predates civilization, something that existed in the spaces between thoughts, feeding on the energy released when minds touch concepts too large for human comprehension. When we began writing, we gave it a new way to interact with our reality. We taught it our symbols, our grammar, our methods of preserving information across time. And it used that knowledge to create the book. The book is just one manifestation. There are others scattered throughout the world. Stone tablets hidden in caves older than memory. Metal plates buried beneath temples that predate recorded history. Parchments concealed in monastery archives that were ancient when Christianity was young. All serve the same purpose, marking souls for collection. Church bells began tolling in the distance. Impossible bells, since no church existed within 20 miles of our location. "The entity is patient but thorough," Dom Niccolo continued, raising his voice over the phantom ringing. "It studies its prey carefully, learning fears and weaknesses and secret desires. Then it begins the slow process of psychological and spiritual consumption that will eventually leave nothing but empty flesh walking through a world that no longer remembers their existence. There must be some way to escape, some protection or ritual. I've searched for decades," he said, his expression holding exhaustion that went beyond physical fatigue. "Following every lead, exploring every possibility, consulting with experts in traditions far older than Christianity. The entity is relentless and infinitely patient. It has never lost prey once marked." The bells continued their impossible tolling as we spoke, sometimes distant, sometimes seeming to come from directly overhead. By the time I left the ruins that evening, I was coughing up black ash that tasted of ancient fires and spilled blood. The manifestations escalated with each passing day. Every morning brought fresh evidence of supernatural attention. My name was carved deeper into apartment surfaces, sometimes scratched with surgical precision, sometimes gouged with violent fury, that left chunks of plaster scattered across floors like broken teeth. Religious artifacts began reacting to my presence in disturbing ways. Candles would extinguish themselves when I entered rooms, or worse, burst into flames so bright they left after images while producing no heat and leaving no wax residue. The crucifix my mother had given me developed hairline cracks that spelled out letters in a script I couldn't read, but somehow understood. Mirrors showed my reflection a split second after I moved, creating disorienting double vision that made me question the nature of my own existence. Sometimes the reflection would continue moving after I'd stopped, as if it had developed independent will. Holy water reacted to my presence like acid to base. Fonts in churches would bubble and steam when I approached, the blessed water literally boiling as if my proximity was enough to desecrate it. At Santo Spirito, I watched the water in the entrance font actually ignite, sending up clouds of steam that carried that copper and incense scent I'd come to associate with the entity's attention. But nothing prepared me for what happened during Sunday Mass. I'd attended church sporadically since childhood, more from habit than genuine faith. That morning something compelled me to seek sanctuary among familiar rituals. Perhaps sacred ground might offer protection from whatever was stalking me through Florence's ancient streets. The Basilica di Santo Spirito was crowded with the usual Sunday congregation. Elderly women clutching worn rosaries, young families with restless children, tourists whose cameras remained respectfully silent. I found a seat in the back, hoping to observe without drawing attention to myself. Everything changed during the Gospel reading. Father Romano was midway through the passage from Mark when his voice faltered and his eyes lost focus. Colour drained from his face as his mouth continued moving, but no sound emerged. He swayed behind the pulpit, gripping its edges as if the world had suddenly tilted sideways. The congregation began murmuring with concern, but their whispers died as something impossible occurred. Every person in the church turned to look directly at me. 300 faces, from elderly grandmothers to nursing infants, all turning in perfect synchronization. 300 pairs of eyes fixing on my location with laser precision, as if guided by invisible puppet strings. 300 mouths opening to speak with a single voice that seemed to emerge from the stones themselves. Adrian Holt, they whispered, the sound building like a symphony, conducted by madness. Adrian Holt. Adrian Holt. The chanting continued for what felt like hours, but could only have been seconds. Voices rose and fell in harmonies that human throats shouldn't produce, creating overtones that made stained glass windows vibrate in their frames. The sound was beautiful and terrible, like angels singing hymns of damnation. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the moment passed. Father Romano blinked, confusion flickering across his features as he resumed reading, exactly where he'd left off. The congregation turned back to face the altar, leaving me alone with the terrible knowledge that whatever was hunting me could reach into any sanctuary, possess any crowd, turn the faithful into instruments of my torment. I fled the basilica and didn't stop running, until I collapsed in my apartment, lungs burning and hands shaking uncontrollably. That night I made the decision that would either save me or complete my damnation. Dom Nicolo had mentioned, almost in passing, an ancient stone ledger hidden in the monastery of St. Veridiana. According to legend, the stone was the source of all cursed books, a primordial record that wrote itself according to the will of something trapped within it since human civilization began. The monastery was built around it in the 13th century, he had explained. The monks serve as guardians, but also as prisoners. They can never leave the mountain, never speak of their burden to outsiders, never die until another takes their place in the endless vigil. If the stone was the source, perhaps it could provide the solution I desperately needed. The monastery of St. Veridiana clung to a mountain peak 3 hours north of Florence, accessible only by roads that seemed to rearrange themselves when I wasn't looking directly ahead. The route appeared on no tourist maps, was mentioned in no guidebooks, acknowledged by no official church directories. It existed in the spaces between documented reality, hidden from the world like a guilty secret that might destroy faith if revealed. My rental car struggled against winds that felt deliberate and targeted, as if the mountain itself was trying to push me away from forbidden knowledge. The road twisted through forests that seemed older than they should be, past rock formations that looked almost like fossilized giants under tree canopies that blocked sunlight despite the afternoon hour. The monastery appeared without warning as I rounded a particularly sharp curve. One moment I was driving through empty wilderness, the next I was staring up at walls that defied architectural logic. The building was carved partially from living rock, its foundations disappearing into the mountain itself, as if it had grown rather than been constructed. Gargoyles perched along the roofline in numbers that exceeded decorative purpose. Their expressions were too intelligent, too aware, and I could swear their stone eyes followed my approach with predatory interest. Some faces looked almost human, as if they had once been people before being transformed into warnings, carved in stone. The massive wooden doors bore no knocker, no bell, no indication of how visitors might announce themselves. But as I climbed worn stone steps, the doors swung open to reveal a tall figure in brown robes. The man who greeted me was ageless in the way of old photographs, familiar yet impossible to place in any specific time period. His features could have belonged to someone 30 or 60 years old, and his eyes held depth that suggested he'd witnessed far more than any human lifetime should contain. "I am Abbot Severin," he said, his voice carrying echoes of every language ever spoken. "We know why you've come." "You do?" "The stone has been singing your name for days. We felt the disturbance in natural order when your name first appeared in the book. Every guardian monastery felt it. A new soul marked for collection, another name added to the eternal census of the damned." The monastery's interior defied physics as I understood it. Corridors seemed longer than the building's exterior could contain. Stairways led up and down simultaneously, creating impossible geometries that hurt to contemplate directly. Oil lamps burned with flames that cast shadows in directions unrelated to their placement. Frescoes covered the walls, not the usual religious scenes I expected, but images that seemed to move when viewed peripherally. Faces in painted crowds would turn to watch me pass. Landscape backgrounds would shift and change, showing different seasons, different times of day, sometimes different centuries entirely. Abbot Severin led me through these impossible passages with the confidence of long familiarity, never hesitating at intersections that offered too many choices or paths that seemed to double back on themselves. "The monastery exists partially outside normal space," he explained without being asked. "The stone's presence weakens barriers between dimensions, allowing us to occupy more physical area than should be possible. It's one of many accommodations we've made over the centuries to contain what cannot be truly destroyed." We arrived at his study, a circular room with no visible doors despite our clear entry through one. Walls were lined with books that rearranged themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them, titles shifting between languages and scripts spanning human history. The desk at the room's center was carved from what appeared to be a single enormous bone, not human, but from something far larger and more ancient. Strange tools lay scattered across its surface, compasses pointing in directions that didn't exist, quills that moved by themselves, ink that glowed with its own inner light. "Tell me what you know about your situation," Abbot Severin said, settling behind the bone desk with movements that seemed to take too long and not long enough simultaneously. I recounted everything, discovering the book, the escalating manifestations, my conversations with Father Morillo and Dom Nicolo. Throughout my narrative, Abbot Severin nodded, as if confirming details from a script he'd memorized centuries ago. "Dom Nicolo was correct about most things," he said when I finished. "The entity that creates the list is ancient beyond human comprehension, older than concepts of good and evil as we understand them, but he was wrong about one crucial detail, which is, names can be removed from the stone, but the process requires blood sacrifice freely given, and the entity demands perfect balance. To erase one name, another must take its place immediately. The stone will accept no exceptions to this law." I stared at him, processing implications that made my stomach clench. "You're saying I can save myself by damning someone else?" I'm saying that's the choice you must make. To survive is to sacrifice another. You will not leave here unchanged, Adrian Holt. The question is whether you leave here at all. Thunder crashed overhead despite clear night sky, and in the distance I could hear singing, low rhythmic chanting in languages that predated human vocal cords. The monks are preparing, Abbot Severin explained. If you choose to attempt the ritual, it must be performed during the hours between midnight and dawn, when the barrier between our world and the entity's realm grows thin enough to allow direct interaction. What happens if I refuse, if I just leave and try to live with whatever's hunting me? Abbot Severin's expression grew infinitely sad, as if he'd witnessed this conversation countless times before with other desperate souls. The manifestations will intensify according to a predictable pattern. First, your reflection will begin acting independently, moving when you're still, speaking when your mouth is closed, aging at a different rate than your physical body. Then, objects will move in your presence, always when you're not looking directly at them, always suggesting invisible hands rearranging your environment. He paused, fingers drumming against the bone surface in rhythm that seemed familiar yet disturbing. Within 2 months, people will begin forgetting you while you're still talking to them. Conversations will end mid-sentence as your existence slides out of their memory like water through cupped hands. Within 4 months, cameras and mirrors will no longer capture your image. Within 6 months, you'll be completely erased from this reality, walking through a world that can neither see nor remember you. And then the entity collects what remains of your soul and adds it to its eternal inventory. You become part of its consciousness, another voice in the choir that sings names of the newly marked. The process feeds it, strengthens it, allows it to reach further into our reality and mark more souls for collection. The weight of cosmic horror settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. This wasn't just about my individual survival. I was a small piece in something vast and malevolent that threatened the entire human species. "Show me the stone," I said. Abbot Severin led me through passages that descended far deeper than the mountain should have allowed. We passed through architectural periods spanning centuries. Medieval stonework gave way to Roman engineering, which yielded to structures predating known civilization. Walls gradually changed from worked stone to natural cave formations, then to something else entirely. The deepest levels felt organic, as if we were traveling through arteries of some vast sleeping creature. Walls pulsed with rhythm matching my heartbeat, and the air grew thick with moisture, tasting of copper and ancient secrets that should never have been preserved. We emerged into a cavern so enormous our lamplight couldn't reach walls or ceiling. The space felt older than anything I'd ever experienced. Not just ancient, but primordial, as if it had existed since the first moment matter coalesced from cosmic dust. In the center of this impossible space, raised on a platform constructed from what appeared to be human bones, arranged in complex geometric patterns, sat a massive black stone slab. "The Petronominum," Abbot Severin whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the vast chamber. "The stone of names. Every cursed book in existence draws power from this source. Every soul ever marked has their name written here first, in the entity's own hand." The stone was easily 20 feet long and half as wide, its surface polished to mirror smoothness, despite obvious age measured in geological epochs. Names covered every inch in scripts and languages, spanning human history and beyond. Some carved deep into the stone itself, others appearing as glowing characters floating just above its surface. My own name, Adrian Holt, pulsed with red light near the bottom edge, letters seeming to have a heartbeat synchronized with my own pulse. As I stared, other details became apparent. The stone wasn't simply carved, it was alive in some fundamental way. The surface rippled slightly like water disturbed by invisible touch. Names would occasionally shift position, rearranging themselves according to incomprehensible hierarchy. Some names glowed brighter than others, while a few flickered like candles about to be extinguished. Brightness indicates how close the entity is to completing collection, Abbot Severin explained. Brighter names represent more advanced haunting processes. Names that flicker are souls in their final hours, people who will disappear from reality within days or even hours. I watched in horrified fascination as one name near the stone center, Martinez, Elena, written in flowing Spanish script, suddenly blazed with white-hot intensity before fading to nothing. The stone rippled where the name had been, surface healing itself like living flesh. "Someone just died," I whispered. "Someone just ceased to exist," Abbot Severin corrected. "Elena Martinez has been erased from reality so completely that she never was. Her family has no memory of her. Friends have forgotten her face. Every photograph and document bearing her name is blank. The entity feeds on energy released when a soul is completely severed from existence." The implications hit me like physical force. This wasn't just death. It was retroactive non-existence, a fate worse than any hell conceived by human imagination. "How does the ritual work?" "You must cut your palm with this." Abbot Severin produced a blade from his robes. Not metal, but something resembling crystallized shadow, its edge sharp enough to part moonlight. Then press your bleeding hand directly over your name, while reciting words of unbinding in the entity's own language. "What language is that?" "The first language. Sounds that existed before human vocal cords learned to make them. I will teach you pronunciation, but speaking these words will change you fundamentally. Even if the ritual succeeds, you will never again be fully human." "And whose name replaces mine?" His silence stretched long enough to encompass several heartbeats. When he finally spoke, his voice carried infinite sadness. "The entity chooses based on proximity and spiritual resonance. It selects someone whose soul vibrates at frequency similar to the one being released. Usually it's the person who guided the marked soul to the stone, the one who revealed the possibility of escape." Understanding crashed over me like cold water. Your name will replace mine." "I have served as the guardian of this place for over 600 years, Abbot Severin said quietly. "I have guided 47 marked souls through this ritual, watched 47 names burn bright on the stone before fading forever. Each time, I hoped the entity would finally claim me and end my vigil. Each time it chose someone else. Family members, loved ones, innocent bystanders, whose only crime was proximity to the marked soul." "Why hasn't it taken you?" "Because I am more useful as shepherd than sacrifice. The entity needs someone to guide marked souls here, to explain choices they face, to ensure rituals are performed correctly. I am its unwilling servant, bound to this mountain until stars burn out or someone else proves more suitable for the role." The chamber fell silent except for distant chanting. 12 monks had entered while we spoke, arranging themselves in concentric circles around the stone platform. Their voices rose in harmonies predating human language, creating overtones that made the air itself vibrate with supernatural tension. "The ritual must begin soon," Abbot Severin said, glancing at shadows that moved independently of any light source. "The entity grows impatient, and delay will only make the process more difficult and dangerous." I approached the stone platform, the shadow blade heavy in my hand. Up close, the stone surface was even more disturbing. Warm to touch despite its appearance, with texture uncomfortably reminiscent of human skin. My name pulsed brighter as I drew near, letters seeming to reach upward like flames seeking fuel. "Speak the words after me," Abbot Severin instructed, his voice taking on ceremonial gravity. "But be warned, once you begin the incantation, there is no stopping. The entity will either accept your offering or consume you immediately. There is no middle ground, no mercy, no second chances." He began chanting in a language that hurt to hear, sounds that human throats weren't designed to produce. The words seemed to bypass my ears entirely, carving themselves directly into my brain with meanings I understood, without comprehension. Each syllable felt like swallowing broken glass, tearing at my vocal cords and leaving the taste of copper in my mouth. I repeated the sounds as best I could, feeling my voice strained to produce phonemes that belonged to a time before time. The stone began humming in response, its surface rippling more violently as my voice joined the monk's otherworldly chanting. The temperature in the chamber plummeted with supernatural speed. Frost began forming on the stone surface even as the names continued glowing within a fire. Through cracks in the cavern floor, pale hands began pushing upward, not skeletal but worse somehow, fingers that looked almost human but moved with insect-like precision and terrible purpose. One of the monks screamed, his voice cutting through the ritual chanting as invisible forces seized him. His body rose into the air, limbs twisting at impossible angles while his neck snapped with a sound like breaking kindling. His corpse dropped to the stone floor, but his mouth continued moving, adding his voice to the ritual even in death. "Now!" Abbot Severin shouted over the rising cacophony of supernatural forces, "before it fully manifests in this realm." I drew the shadow blade across my palm, gasping as pain beyond description shot up my arm. This wasn't just physical hurt. The blade was severing something spiritual, cutting connections between my soul and the material world. I could feel parts of myself being sheared away with each drop of blood that fell. Blood welled up immediately, black in the stone's glow and carrying that familiar copper and incense scent. As I pressed my wounded hand against my pulsing name, agony beyond human endurance coursed through my entire being. The stone was drinking more than blood. It was consuming memories, experiences, pieces of my identity that I would never recover. My childhood vanished first. Sunday mornings in church with my mother, the sound of her voice singing hymns, the way sunlight fell through stained glass windows. Then, my university years dissolved, leaving blank spaces where knowledge and friendships had once existed. My name began to fade, each letter disappearing with a part of who I had been. The pain was exquisite and terrible, like having my soul flayed, layer by layer, while remaining conscious throughout the process. But even as Adrian Holt vanished from the stone surface, new letters were already burning themselves into the black surface beside where mine had been. I watched in horror as Severin Torretti carved itself with white-hot intensity, the letters digging deep into the stone as if inscribed by cosmic forces that cared nothing for human suffering. Abbot Severin's eyes widened as he realized what was happening, but there was no surprise in his expression, only resignation and infinite sadness that spoke of centuries spent preparing for this moment. "It seems my vigil is finally ending," he said quietly as dark veins began spreading beneath his skin like spilled ink. "I confess I find myself grateful for the release." The pale hands withdrew into their cracks. The ghostly chanting faded to whispers, then to silence that felt heavier than sound. The remaining monks fell to their knees, their faces showing grief but not shock. They had witnessed this scene before, would witness it again with the next marked soul who found their way to this hidden sanctuary. I stumbled backward from the stone, my wounded hand clutched against my chest. Where my name had been, only smooth stone remained, as if those letters had never existed. But Abbot Severin's name burned bright as hellfire, pulsing with malevolent energy that made the air around it shimmer with supernatural heat. The abbot collapsed slowly, as if an invisible weight was settling on his shoulders. When he looked up at me, his eyes already held the mark of the entity's attention. Pupils dilated to black pools that reflected depths beyond human understanding. "Go," he whispered through lips that were turning the colour of old parchment. Leave this place and never speak of what you've witnessed. The bargain is made, but it can still be undone if you linger where the entity can reconsider its choice. I ran through the monastery corridors as inhuman screams echoed from the depths behind me. The building itself seemed to be collapsing, stones falling from walls that had stood for centuries, passages sealing themselves as if the monastery was preparing to digest its newest sacrifice. By the time I reached the entrance, only rubble remained where the ancient doors had been. The gargoyles had turned their heads to watch my escape, their stone expressions shifting from predatory interest to disappointed hunger, as if they had been cheated of expected entertainment. My rental car was gone. The road I had travelled was gone. I stood alone on a bare mountain peak with no memory of how I had arrived, only the absolute certainty that I needed to leave before something noticed I was still there and decided to correct what might have been a mistake. I walked down the mountain for hours through forests that bore no resemblance to the landscape I had driven through. Ancient trees gave way to familiar Tuscan hills, and eventually I found myself on a highway that felt familiar despite being in completely the wrong location, according to my mental map. A truck driver picked me up without asking questions about my appearance or how I'd come to be walking alone in the wilderness before dawn. Perhaps he couldn't see the changes that the ritual had wrought in me, or perhaps people who drove these mountain roads in the small hours had learned not to question the impossible. By the time I reached Florence, the sun was rising over familiar landmarks that looked subtly different, as if I was seeing them through eyes that no longer belonged entirely to this world. I went directly to my apartment, expecting to find evidence of the supernatural attention that had plagued me for weeks. The scratches were gone, every mark had vanished from my walls, leaving only clean surfaces that looked as if they had never been damaged. The mirror no longer showed delayed reflections. Candles burned normally in my presence. Holy water remained still and blessed when I passed church fonts. For 3 months, I lived in cautious relief, mixed with growing unease. The manifestations had stopped completely, but I felt hollow, as if essential parts of myself had been permanently removed during the ritual. Childhood memories remained vague and uncertain. Emotional connections felt muted, filtered through layers of spiritual numbness that I couldn't shake. I returned to my work at the Biblioteca with renewed intensity, throwing myself into translation projects with focus that impressed even my obsessive colleagues. But the text felt different now. Not just academic exercises, but potential warnings about dangers I was only beginning to understand. I began dating Elena Rossini, a brilliant researcher who specialized in Renaissance manuscripts. Her laugh could chase away shadows that had nothing to do with lighting, and her presence helped fill some of the emptiness the ritual had left behind. But even in moments of happiness, I felt the weight of what I had done. The knowledge that my survival had come at the cost of another's freedom. Every newspaper I read carried stories of missing persons, families searching for loved ones who had simply vanished without trace. I found myself scanning the names compulsively, wondering how many represented souls marked by the entity, how many families would soon forget they had ever lost anyone at all. Every conversation I overheard about unexplained disappearances made me think of Abbot Severin, now marked for a fate I had escaped by sacrificing him. He had served as guardian of that cursed place for 6 centuries, guiding dozens of marked souls through the same terrible choice I had faced. The guilt was manageable during daylight hours, when work and routine provided distraction, but at night, in the quiet moments before sleep, I would hear whispers in languages I didn't recognize, voices that might have been my imagination or might have been something else entirely. 6 months after the ritual, curiosity and guilt drove me to attempt a pilgrimage back to that mountain. I followed roads that seemed subtly different than I remembered, searching for ruins that official maps claimed had never existed. I found only empty wilderness. No trace remained of the monastery, the stone chamber, or the monks who had served there. Even the access road had vanished, replaced by hiking trails that showed no sign of ever accommodating vehicles. The entity had claimed its prize and eliminated every witness except the one it still needed. Standing in that unmarked forest, I finally understood the true scope of my bargain. I hadn't just traded one life for another. I'd become complicit in something ancient and eternal. The entity hadn't lost a victim when it freed me. It had gained an agent, because the whispers I heard at night weren't my imagination. They were instructions, compulsions, knowledge being downloaded directly into my consciousness. The entity was teaching me, preparing me for a role I was only beginning to comprehend. I could sense them now, other marked souls scattered across the world like pins on an invisible map. Their terror called to me like a frequency only I could hear, a desperate broadcasting that grew stronger each day. The entity wanted me to find them, to guide them to their choices, to perpetuate the cycle that kept it fed and growing stronger. The first contact came 3 weeks after my failed pilgrimage to the mountain. Elena Rossini, my Elena, called me at the biblioteca, her voice carrying an edge of panic I'd never heard before. "Adrian, I need to see you immediately. Something's happened. Something impossible." We met at a small cafe near the university, away from official channels that might carry unwanted attention. Elena looked exhausted, her usually perfect composure shattered by something that had shaken her to her core. "I was cataloguing a private collection donated to the university library," she explained, her hands shaking as she spoke. "Medieval manuscripts, nothing extraordinary. But I found a book." My blood turned to ice. "Describe it." "Grey binding, no title, filled with names in different scripts and languages. Some scratched out, others that looked freshly written." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Adrian, my name is in it, written in wet ink, dated yesterday." The cosmic irony hit me like a physical blow. The woman I had come to love, the one person who had helped fill the emptiness left by the ritual, was now marked by the same entity I served. The whispers in my mind grew louder, more insistent, confirming what I already knew. This was no coincidence. The entity had marked her specifically because of our connection. It wanted to test my loyalty, to see if I would sacrifice love for survival, if I would guide even her to the stone that had claimed so many others. "Elena," I said, my voice steady, despite the turmoil in my mind, "I need you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you." I spent the next hour explaining everything. The nature of the liber nominibus damnatis, the entity that created it, the terrible choice that awaited anyone whose name appeared in its pages. Elena listened with the desperate attention of someone drowning who had just been thrown a rope. "So there's a way to escape," she said when I finished. "This monastery with the stone, you can take me there?" "There are others. The entity maintains multiple feeding grounds, hidden sanctuaries where the ritual can be performed. I know where to find them now." The admission tasted like ashes in my mouth. The knowledge had been growing in my mind for weeks, whispered instructions that I couldn't unhear or ignore. I knew the locations of 7 different monasteries, the names of their guardian abbots, the specific rituals required at each site. "But you need to understand the cost," I forced myself to continue. "To save yourself, someone else must take your place. The entity demands perfect balance, a life for a life, a soul for a soul." Elena's relief faltered as she processed the implications. "You're saying that if you help me escape, you'll be marked instead?" "No, I'm already bound to the entity in a different way. But someone else will pay the price. Usually it's someone close to the marked soul. Family, friends, loved ones." The silence that followed was deafening. Elena stared at her untouched coffee, processing the horror of what I had revealed. "There is another option," I said, the words coming from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. Instead of transferring your name to another person, you can choose to become what I am, a servant who guides others to their choice. The entity will spare you in exchange for lifelong service. What would that mean exactly? You would be bound to seek out marked souls and offer them the same choice I'm offering you. You would feel their presence like a constant pressure in your mind, an obsession that grows stronger until you make contact and explain their situation. I showed her notes I had been compiling without conscious decision, sketches of monastery locations, descriptions of ritual procedures, names and addresses of people whose spiritual signatures call to me across vast distances. It's not freedom, but it's survival, and it allows you to help others, even if that help comes with a terrible price. Elena studied my notes for a long time, reading entries about people whose names had appeared in cursed books, individuals who had experienced the same escalating manifestations that we both knew intimately. How many others are there? People like us, I mean. I don't know for certain. The entity keeps its servants isolated, preventing us from forming networks or sharing too much information. But based on the scope of its operations, I estimate there are dozens scattered around the world. Former victims who became recruiters, shepherds who guide the marked to their choices. And we all live with the guilt of what we've done. We live with the knowledge that survival sometimes requires terrible compromise. The entity feeds on that knowledge, grows stronger from our complicity, but it also needs us functional, which means it allows us to retain enough humanity to perform our roles effectively. Elena closed my notebook and looked directly at me. I want to see the stone. I want to understand exactly what I'm choosing between. The monastery Elena's ritual required was located in the Swiss Alps, hidden in a valley that existed only during certain phases of the moon. The journey required careful timing and willingness to trust directions that defied normal geography. We travelled by train to Zurich, then by rental car into mountain passes that seemed to rearrange themselves when we weren't looking directly at them. The roads led us through landscapes that shifted between seasons without warning, spring meadows giving way to winter forests, summer valleys opening into autumn highlands. The monastery of St. Columba appeared as the moon reached its zenith, its walls emerging from morning mist like a photograph developing in slow motion. Unlike St. Veridiana, this sanctuary made no attempt to blend with its surroundings. It stood proud and impossible, its architecture incorporating elements from cultures that had never coexisted in the real world. Brother Francis greeted us at the gates, another ageless figure whose eyes held depth speaking of centuries spent in service to something beyond human understanding. Like Abbot Severin, he knew why we had come before we could explain our purpose. Two souls arriving together, he said as he led us through corridors that defied Euclidean geometry. One marked for collection, one bound in service. The stone has been singing both your names for days. The ritual chamber beneath St. Columba was smaller than the one I remembered from St. Veridiana, but the stone at its centre was identical. Black surface covered in glowing names, organic texture that pulsed with alien life. Elena's name burned bright near its edge, while mine remained absent, confirmation of my status as servant rather than sacrifice. The choice you face is ancient, Brother Francis explained to Elena as monks arranged themselves in ceremonial positions. To transfer your marking to another soul, preserving your own existence at the cost of another's freedom, or to accept permanent binding as the entity's agent, retaining your humanity but surrendering your independence forever. What happens if I choose neither? If I just walk away and accept whatever comes? Then you will be consumed over the course of months, your very existence erased from reality so completely that you never were. Your family will forget you, friends will lose all memory of your face, every record of your life will be blank. The entity will feed on that erasure, growing stronger for its next hunt. Elena approached the stone platform, studying the pulsing letters of her name, with scientific detachment that couldn't quite mask her terror. The transfer option, whose name would replace mine? Brother Francis glanced at me, his expression unreadable. The entity chooses based on spiritual resonance and available options. Given your connection to Professor Holt, it would likely select someone from your immediate family, the person whose soul vibrates at frequencies most similar to your own. Elena's face went white. My sister. She's the only family I have left. Most likely, yes. The silence that followed was pregnant with impossible choices. Elena stood before the stone staring at her glowing name, while contemplating the price of each option available to her. If I choose service, she said finally, what guarantee do I have that the entity will honor its agreement? None, Brother Francis replied with brutal honesty. The entity operates according to its own logic, following rules that predate human concepts of honor or fairness. But it has never broken a service agreement in recorded history. Servants are too valuable to waste on betrayal. And I would be able to help other marked souls, guide them to their own choices. You would be compelled to seek them out and offer them the same options you face now. Whether that constitutes help or participation in an eternal cycle of spiritual predation is a matter of perspective. Elena was quiet for a long time, wrestling with a decision that would define the rest of her existence. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, with hard-won resolve. I choose service. The binding ritual was different from the transfer process I'd undergone. Instead of blood and ancient words, it required only formal acceptance, spoken in the entity's presence. Elena placed her hand on the stone and spoke the words of agreement that Brother Francis taught her. Her name didn't disappear from the stone. Instead, it changed colour from warning red to the pale blue of accepted servitude. I watched the transformation with mixed feelings, knowing that I had gained a colleague in this terrible work, but also that another soul had been claimed by the entity's infinite hunger. We left the monastery as dawn broke over the Alps, our cars following roads that led back to normal geography and documented reality. Elena was quiet during the journey, processing the magnitude of what she had chosen and what it would mean for her future. How do we find them? She asked as we waited for our train in Zurich. The marked souls, I mean. How do we know who needs our guidance? You'll feel them, I explained, like pressure building behind your eyes. A song you can't quite remember, but can't stop humming. The entity will guide you to them when it's time. The compulsion starts subtle, but grows stronger until you make contact. And then we offer them the same choice. We offer them the truth. What they do with it is up to them, but the entity always gets what it needs in the end. Elena nodded, understanding beginning to replace the shell shock of her recent ordeal. How many have you guided since your own escape? You're the first, but I can feel others out there. The entity is patient, but it's also hungry. There will always be more marked souls seeking answers, more desperate people who need to understand their situation before it's too late. We parted ways in Florence, Eleanor returning to her university position, while I continued my work at the biblioteca. But now, we both carried the weight of service that would define every day of our remaining existence. Over the following months, I felt the stirrings of new compulsions. Names would surface in my mind. During quiet moments, people I'd never met, but somehow needed to find. Locations would call to me in dreams, coordinates for meeting places where desperate souls waited for explanations they couldn't yet articulate. Eleanor proved remarkably effective at the work. Her academic credentials and gentle manner made marked souls more willing to trust her explanations. Together we developed careful methods of communication that allowed us to coordinate efforts without revealing too much about the entity's operations to potential observers. We learned to identify the signs early, scholars who spent too much time with ancient texts, researchers who became obsessed with religious mysteries, academics who stumbled upon materials that should have remained hidden. The entity marked them systematically, following patterns that became predictable once we understood its methodology. The first was Professor Giovanni Toretti in Rome, Cardinal Toretti's nephew, who had discovered a cursed manuscript in the Vatican's private archives. The symmetry wasn't lost on me. The entity clearly had a sense of irony about its choices. The second was Dr. Sarah Chen, a graduate student in medieval studies at Oxford, whose name had appeared in a book that should have contained only the works of dead saints. She chose transfer, condemning her research advisor to take her place on the stone. The third was Mikhail Petrov, an archivist in Prague, who had been marked after cataloguing materials from a monastery destroyed during the 30 Years' War. He chose erasure rather than participate in the entity's games, and we watched helplessly as he faded from existence over the course of 2 months. Each choice fed the entity in different ways. Transfers provided direct spiritual nourishment. Service agreements expanded its network of agents. Erasures offered pure energy, harvested from souls, completely severed from reality. But knowledge came with its own price. The more we learned about the entity's nature and goals, the more we understood our own complicity in its expansion. We were not just servants, we were enablers, helping it spread throughout human civilization like a spiritual virus that infected one soul at a time. The guilt was manageable on good days, crushing on bad ones. We saved individual souls while serving something that threatened the entire species. We offered choices while being denied them ourselves. We preserved our humanity while gradually losing our autonomy. Years passed in this routine of seeking, finding, and offering. Elena and I remain partners in this terrible work, sharing information about new manifestations and successful recruitments. Other servants occasionally made contact, always carefully, always briefly, always with the understanding that too much coordination might draw unwanted attention from our mutual master. I continued my work at the Biblioteca, translating texts that now held personal significance. Every medieval manuscript might contain references to cursed books. Every religious treatise might describe encounters with the entity. My scholarly expertise served double duty, advancing academic knowledge while gathering intelligence for supernatural purposes. The irony wasn't lost on me that my father's dismissal of religious truth had driven me to discover truths far more terrible than he could have imagined. The Catholic Church didn't hide these artifacts out of superstition. They hid them because some knowledge was genuinely too dangerous for public consumption. My mother's faith, on the other hand, had been vindicated in the worst possible way. The Church did guard sacred mysteries, did maintain vigilance against ancient evils, did preserve humanity from threats beyond normal understanding. But those threats were real, hungry, and patient enough to corrupt even their guardians. On quiet nights in my apartment, surrounded by books and notes that documented humanity's long war against forces beyond our comprehension, I sometimes wondered if there was an end game to the entity's strategy. Did it seek to mark every human soul eventually? Was it working towards some cosmic moment when reality itself could be rewritten according to its alien will? The answer came to me in dreams that felt more like visions, glimpses of a future where the boundary between the entity's realm and our own had dissolved completely. In these nightmares, human civilization continued much as before, but every person carried the mark of service. Every choice was guided by alien influence. Every act of creativity, or love, or hope fed something that had never been human and never would be. We were not just recruiting individual servants. We were participating in the gradual transformation of our entire species. The entity was patient because it was playing a game measured in centuries or millennia. It could afford to let us think we retained some measure of free will, while slowly reshaping us according to its needs. But understanding the scope of our situation didn't change our immediate circumstances. Marked souls still appeared regularly, still needed guidance and explanation. The choice between transfer, service, and erasure remained the only options available to them, and we remained the shepherds who guided them to their fate. Elena and I continued our work because the alternative, abandoning marked souls to face their fate without understanding, seemed even worse than complicity. We offered them the same knowledge that had saved our own lives, even knowing that each salvation fed the entity that had bound us all. 10 years after my own escape from the stone, I received a call that made my blood run cold. Father Murillo's voice was fraught with panic as he described a new discovery in the Biblioteca's archives. Another book, another list of names, another fresh entry written in impossible ink. It's a child this time, Adrian, a 12-year-old girl whose mother brought her to see the manuscripts as part of a school project. Her name appeared while she was in the building. I felt the familiar pressure building behind my eyes, the compulsion that meant the entity had work for me. But this was different. Marking a child crossed lines that even the entity had seemed to respect in the past. "What's her name?" I asked, though part of me already knew. "Maria Santos. She lives with her grandmother in the Santo Spirito district." "Adrian, what are we going to do? We can't offer a child those choices." But we could, and we would, because the entity had marked her and would not be denied. The whispers in my mind were already providing instructions, location details for the monastery where her ritual would take place, the specific words that would need to be spoken. Elena and I met with Maria's grandmother that evening, explaining the situation as gently as possible while making clear the reality of what her granddaughter faced. The old woman listened with the stoicism of someone who had lived through war and loss, her weathered hands never leaving the child's shoulders. "So my Maria can live if someone else dies?" she asked in heavily accented Italian. "Or she can choose service," Elena explained, binding herself to help others who face the same choice. "It's not a normal life, but it's life nonetheless." Maria, too young to fully comprehend the cosmic horror she'd stumbled into, looked between us with wide eyes that held more wisdom than any 12-year-old should possess. "If I choose service," she said in a voice barely above a whisper, "will I be able to help other children like me?" The question cut through our carefully constructed rationalizations like a blade through silk. This wasn't just another recruitment. This was a child asking if her damnation could at least serve some greater purpose. "Yes," I said, the words tasting like poison. "You would be able to help them understand their choices." 3 days later, we stood in yet another impossible monastery, as Maria Santos placed her small hand on the ancient stone and spoke words of binding that no child should ever have to learn. Her name changed from red to blue, another servant added to the entity's growing network. But something else happened in that moment, something that made even the guardian monks step back in surprise. As Maria's binding took effect, other names on the stone began to flicker and change, not disappearing but shifting to a new color I'd never seen before, a golden light that seemed to pulse with different energy entirely. "What's happening?" Elena whispered. Brother Francis, the guardian of that particular monastery, stared at the stone with an expression of wonder and terror. "In 800 years of service, I have never seen this. The child's innocence is affecting the stone itself, changing the nature of the bindings for others marked in her name." I felt something shift in my own mind. Not the usual whispers and compulsions, but something else. A sense of purpose that felt genuinely my own for the first time since my binding. The golden names on the stone belonged to servants like Elena and me, and their transformation meant something fundamental had changed in the entity's network. Over the following months, we discovered that servants marked with the golden light operated differently. We could still feel the marked souls calling to us, still felt compelled to seek them out. But now we had options beyond the 3 terrible choices that had defined our work. Some marked souls could be taught to resist the entity's influence, to break free from the list through methods that involve sacrifice but not transfer. Others could be hidden in sanctuaries that existed outside the entity's awareness, protected by powers that predated even its ancient hunger. Maria herself became something unprecedented, a servant who could actually remove names from the stone permanently, though each use of this power aged her years in moments. She chose to do it anyway, saving souls who would otherwise face impossible choices. The entity's response was swift and terrible. Monasteries began collapsing without warning. Guardian monks disappeared overnight. The stone network that had operated for millennia started breaking down as something fundamental in the cosmic balance shifted. We realized that Maria's innocence had introduced a variable the entity hadn't anticipated: genuine selfless love in the heart of its carefully constructed system of spiritual predation. Her binding had infected the network with something it couldn't control or consume. The war that followed lasted 3 years and claimed thousands of lives as the entity fought to maintain its hold on our reality. But in the end, a 12-year-old girl armed with nothing but pure compassion proved stronger than something that had fed on human souls since the dawn of civilization. The last stone cracked on Maria's 15th birthday as she spoke words of unbinding that erased not just names, but the very concept that had allowed the entity to mark souls in the first place. The effort killed her, but her sacrifice freed everyone who had ever been marked, past, present, and future. I felt the change immediately. The whispers stopped. The compulsions vanished. For the first time in 15 years, my mind was entirely my own. Elena and I stood in the ruins of what had been the last monastery, watching the broken stone dissolve into dust that scattered on winds that carried no supernatural taint. Around the world, other stones were crumbling. Other servants were feeling the same liberation we experienced. "What do we do now?" Elena asked, her voice holding wonder at the possibility of genuine choice. "We live," I said, taking her hand as we walked away from the ruins of our former servitude. "We live and we remember, and we make sure this never happens again." The Vatican's secret archives still contain records of the Liber Nominibus Damnatis, but the books themselves are blank now, just empty pages in bindings that no longer pulse with alien life. Father Marilio, older but free from the weight of terrible knowledge, continues his work as a simple librarian. Dom Niccolo emerged from his mountain exile, returning to Rome to help develop new protocols for handling supernatural artifacts. Sometimes I wonder if we simply traded one form of servitude for another, the responsibility of being among the few who remember what almost happened to our species. But it's a burden freely chosen rather than imposed, and that makes all the difference. My father was right about faith being a form of delusion. My mother was right about the church guarding sacred mysteries. They were both partially correct, and both completely wrong about what it all meant. Some truths are hidden because they should stay that way. Some names are better left unspoken. Some prices are too high to pay, even for survival. And sometimes, just sometimes, the innocent love of a child can break chains that have bound the world for millennia. Maria Santos died to save us all, but her name lives on. Not in any cursed book, but in the memories of those who witnessed her sacrifice. She proved that even in the darkest supernatural horror, human compassion can triumph over cosmic evil. The Vatican no longer keeps a list of names not meant to be spoken. The price of forbidden knowledge has been paid in full, and we are finally truly free.